Thank you for joining the presentation. My name is Marta GIL and I work at Vortex. And I'm going to talk about the use of zarr file study. So for a little bit of context, I work at Vortex, which is an atmospheric modeling company that offers on-demand simulations, so wind simulations using the weather and research and forecast model. And the goal of that is to offer wind scientists some resource assessment capabilities so that they can perform their preferred methods over these wind flow maps. And we are currently having, we have a new product which is called Blocks, and that it's going to offer time series. So, like for a region, you would be able to choose some heights and some latitude and longitude points and extract time series everywhere. And while we were developing that product, we dealt with some problems of storage that I'm going to talk about, and we decided to change to zarr format. So this is going to be a little bit of the overview of our experience and some guidelines that may help you decide which are the better formats to use. So first I'm going to talk about what are the objectives of this presentation and offer a brief introduction of some important and then to show experiments we ran and which were the results, and try to make some take-home messages for all of you. So what we want to explain is why are we wanting to do this four-dimensional wind model data datasets, and try to explain what are the challenges of doing that, and try to compare the traditional netcdf format with these zarr files, and try to explain some examples and do some tests playing around and try to offer some guidelines of how these chunks could be chosen to be useful for the wind industry. So this is not it's not the goal of this presentation is not to offer a complete computational test. So this is something that has been done in a specific computer with some software and some hardware that I'm not going to go into the details. So if you are interested in that, we can talk later and discuss about repeatability of the experiments and what can the first thing I want to do is to introduce why would we like this blocks product, and it is just the ability of storing the full simulation, right? So when you simulate, you actually have a bunch of time series, and the problem at Vortex would be to be able to offer our customers the possibility of accessing through the interface to the time series that they wanted, and filtering the time series to have some mean wind maps on summer, wind maps at the night, something and this challenge. And what what we were offering right now were like this is the farm product, which would be like regional maps and things like covering a region but would be collapsed in the time domain. And when we were able to give a time series, like 30 years time series, you would have to go to just having one point of that. And therefore, these blocks try to be the joining of these two great needs, and offer some more complete packaging. So what we are talking about is our 30-minute here, one of the constraints of the storage at 100-meter resolution and vertical heights up to 300 meters, and the standard variables for wind datasets. And what we wanted was that this storage was as small as possible, but that it offered fast access to this data if we wanted to compute some things on demand. So the output of the WRF simulations was right now this netcdf format, which is a very standard for sharing scientific data. And what we were using to open that are some Python packages, basically xarray, which is for labeled multidimensional arrays, and it's integrated with tasks that can support these parallel computations and make operations on datasets that don't fit into memory without really having to personalize it a lot. So it offers a lot of flexibility and it's very easy to use. So that's what we were using. and trying to make computations easier. And then we discovered that these ZAR files have been added as an X-ray so that you could use X-ray to read these kind of files. And these kind of files, these ZAR files are a cloud-friendly data format implemented in Python and stores chunked, compressed, and dimensional arrays. So the idea is that it stores files just as X-ray with task would need to read them, and they are stored in a chunked way that you can personalize, and it offers a lot of flexibility so that you can treat these data sets as if they files. Your it will still work, and you can append data to these ZAR files, and they will be more compressed than etcdf files, so they'll reduce the storage space while increasing accessing times. We wanted to test and make some settings to test these ideas, to test that ZAR offered a benefit compared to 10 netcdf files, and wanted to check how chunks could affect the performance. So what we are going to study for the next slides is going to be subject that I'm going to introduce. Sorry, one moment, I have to drink. Okay, so what we have available are 3 years of 30-minute data for a big data set, which is 300 by 300 grid points with 9 vertical levels, and we're only going to consider a subset of variables, these float 4-dimensional variables, which will be temperature and wind components, UMV. Okay, so this data set has been generated by WRF for daily simulations. So we have the results of each daily simulation in an ETF. So at the end, what we have is 1,000 daily netcdf files. And in the whole, this whole data set, it's 470 gigabytes. What we are going to do is going to use Python, Xarray and Dask, basically, to open these netcdf files or the ZAR files that we are going to create and analyze them, okay? And what we are going to do is to compare these 4 actions that we could be interested in. 2 of them are computing a mean layer, and the other ones are extracting a time series. The complexity. It's an easy mean layer because it's a variable that's already in the data set, and we are computing it at a level that's already in the data set. But computing a mean wind speed layer at an interpolated level, it's harder, right? Because it has to compare and combine UMV and interpolate at a certain height. We are also going to do the same for the extraction of a time series. We can extract it at an existing point, or interpolate some latitude, longitude. Since what we want to do is to see how the period of the data set or the spatial dimensions may influence the storage space and retrieval times of information, we are going to do these tests with several subsets. So different grids that will go from 26 to 26 grids to 300 by 300 grids, each time more or less doubling the site of the grid, so multiplying by 4 the area of the site. And we are also going to consider some different periods, okay? That this will be simply considered a small amount of daily files, kind of monthly to three years, okay? Here, to be fair, what we've done is that these smaller grids, we have saved them in small daily netcdf files to pretend that they were real netcdf files that covered a smaller area, because otherwise cutting them inside Xarray and Python could alter the results. Afterwards, what we have done is for each of these subsets, we create ZAR datasets. So we open the files that we need, and by default, when you upload them to Python, they are going to be chunked daily. Okay, so by default, if you open multiple files, what Xarray does to consider that is divided in the same structure as the files that you ask to load. In this case, since we have daily files with 48 timestamps each, then you have chunks that are length 48 in the dimension time. when we have this, when we have loaded this data set, we can rechunk it. We'll see in the next slide different choices of these chunking methods. And afterwards, we will save ZAR in order to analyze it later. And what we are going to do in this saving of a ZAR is we are going to encode the variables as integers too. So we are going to do two things. So from the netcdf that come out from a post-processing of the work simulations, we are going to encode the variables as integers. So like this will reduce 50% of the size because they will pass from floats to integers by some encoding. And then we are going to save them as ZAR files. And the ZARs that we want to compare are going to be these 5 that I explained here. So with each of the chunking strategy, which are the chunks they were using. For example, the daily chunks, which are the default way of loading these netcdf or daily ZAR files, will have very small chunks in time dimension, daily chunks, and no chunks on space. We then are going to introduce the fact of doing monthly chunks, and we'll have 3 different ZARs that will have monthly chunks, kind of monthly chunks, and we'll distinguish between one with no spatial chunks, one that will store each level in a separate chunk, and then another one which will chunk in great detail the grid. So it will store different little parts of the grid, subgrids in different chunks. And at last, we're going to compute this year special 20 that is going to consider even bigger chunks in time, but keep the small chunks in space that we used for the previous chunking strategy. Okay, so in the results, we're going to show in the NF versus ZAR. Okay, so in this case, what we are comparing is the chunking strategy is the daily chunking strategy. We are not going to go into details of other chunking strategies. And here what we want to see is that the improvement in the reduction of the storage, it's 3 times. Okay, so if we compare a dataset stored in ZAR with the datasets compared to netcdf are 3.1 times bigger than the ones saved in a ZAR file, which we could expect a number 2 because the 50% of storage was then thanks to this data encoding. There is a fraction which is the encoding, but the ZAR files actually compress the data. And in this case, if we want, we can see which is the mean layer extraction time. And we see that for mean temperature layer, which is the easy mean layer because temperature is present in the data set and it's in a existing height, we see that ZAR files go way faster, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of overhead due to the increased size of the grid. Okay, so if the data set is longer, it takes longer, but the size of the grid doesn't appear to play a big role. While in these netcdf files, see especially here that may have to do with the moment the test was made and how the computer was set or something, but we see that the time will increase as if the grid is a little bit bigger. Take into account that you're talking about a 50 by 50 grid, so it's still a small grid. We are not using the full grid that we had 300 by 300. And so yes, in these both cases, we see ZAR files improve the times. And when we check for time series extraction, we also see the same behavior. There's an improvement, but not a very big improvement. And so here what we can say is that this improvement from using netcdf to using ZAR formats is probably due to the reduction of the size of the data set, and that it was very helpful to save it in ZAR format because it had some encoding and compression, and it didn't offer an overhead to reading and accessing the data. And as a reference, we can take this idea of that to interpolate a 3 years time series by 15 minutes. And we are going to see how other chunking strategies that are not the day strategy will prove to be way more efficient. As a side note here, it's also possible to chunk the datasets in XRI that have been loaded from netcdf files, and we did these experiments, but the results were not meaningful. So we are not going to consider this possibility in this presentation. So for the sizes, it's very clear, more or less all sizes have the same. It's not exactly the same, but very similar. And I just wanted to show this plot to see how with which experiments we did. Okay, so for the bigger grids, we only considered up to 1 year of data. And these other longer periods experiments, we only did them for the smaller grids, because we think that with that you can see the behavior and you don't have to spend so many resources. So for the computation of a mean wind speed layer, we can already see a lot of differences between the different chunking strategies. Especially we can see here is the strategy. So no chunks in space and kind of long chunks in time, that the time of computation just goes up very, very quickly. And therefore we didn't compute it for the bigger grid. And we can see that this one and this one, both of them, seem to have a very good performance, and they are quite different because this has monthly chunks, whereas this one has yearly chunks, and this one is chunked in lateral on LEP, and this one is only chunked in LEP. When we see it is the same, I'll compare a little more the behavior and the shapes it does, which is something that will probably depend a lot on the software and the hardware we are using to run these tests. And we can see with the interpolation of a point of a time series exactly what we were trying to find. Okay, so trying to see that you can find a chunking strategy that will allow you to extract time series very fast compared to doing that from an etcdf collection of files, or doing that from a zarr file, which is not very smartly chunked. And with the located these relationships for this type of chunk doesn't depend a lot on the size of the grid, and it increases very slowly with respect to the length of the data set. Okay, and we can see in this example at the end, this strategy, which is the one that we thought was better. We can see that this picture, the time that it takes to compute the mean wind speed layer, is almost the same picture as the size of the data set. So computing a mean wind speed layer is proportional to the gigabytes, and the behavior will follow these rules. Whereas interpolating a point in this kind of chunking, where the chunking is on yearly, okay, so we have to take into account that all of these points have, except these ones, in these cases they are the time is the same chunk, and this allows it to go very quickly. Okay, and it almost doesn't depend on the side of the grid, because this chunking is made in the space. That's very interesting. So the conclusions of this second part of the results would be that there is a huge difference between these chunking strategies, that we should play around a little bit when we have some data set and we know which kind of actions we want to make, and we know which kind of data we have, and that it would be very interesting to try different chunking strategies, try to organize some more or less fixed experiment, and try to see whether the times, the expected times and things like this for your computer and your system and and this possibility that from having to wait 1 minute to extract one time series, if we had stayed with the netcdf format, and playing around with these zarrs, we can improve this time greatly and then make it more smooth in our interface to offer the customers this kind of data sets. So the take-home messages of this talk, that I hope was interesting for some, maybe it was a bit plain or easy for the ones that are more experts on this data analysis. What I wanted to say is that these 4-dimensional wind data sets can be handled easily with Python packages. Even if we choose zarr files or netcdf files, the behavior and the dealing of these data sets will be very similar. You don't have to learn a lot more. And storage format saves a lot of storage space and also time to access the data. And it is important to choose the correct chunking strategy, which in our experience is a strategy that has quite large time chunks and small space chunks. So thank you for your attention. If you want to have more detailed results and more in-depth analysis of what I've been shown here, please contact me at marta.gil@vortexftc.com, and I'll be happy to explain things in more detail. And otherwise, if you have questions now, I would also be very happy to